Work is essential for upward mobility, stability, and overall well-being. Yet for millions of men across the United States, work is increasingly not part of their lives.
Not engaging much in civil society. Very little worship. Very little charitable activity. Very little volunteering. They've got a lot of time on their hands, but they don't say that they're helping out around the house much, or that they're helping with other people at home.
On this episode, we sit down with Nick Eberstadt, author of the book Men Without Work, to explore why millions of working-age men in America are no longer working or looking for a job, why it matters for the country, and what to do about it. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week I'm very excited to have back in the studio Beth Akers, Senior Fellow for AEI and a contributor for us here. Beth, welcome back.
Hi, Nick. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have you in the room because I think I joke in this interview we're about to play for our audience that I am not an economist, so I like bringing you along to bring your economic expertise and insights. And this week we talked with Nick Eberstadt. He's a AEI fellow as well. He actually wrote a book called Men Without Work.
Yes.
That's kind of in this theme of conversations about the well-being of men and boys. Just give us a preview. What does our audience need to be looking for as we get into this great interview?
Yeah, so super excited to have Nick, who's a friend and a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. Nick is a scholar that really is serious about data. So, he's telling the story of what's happening with men and boys in our economy, particularly with the labor market. And, he's not telling stories here. He's telling us exactly what happened. He's going to, be really heavy in the data, which I think we need to kind of follow, stick with it. But we get to some really exciting stuff here. And I think talking about some solutions that are a little bit outside the box, and it's really exciting to have this conversation with Nick.
One of the things that stood out to me from it is a lot of what we do here at Sutherland in our Work and Opportunity Initiative, we've talked about this a lot on this show, of how to sort of make the role of work more prevalent in our social safety net in particular.
Yeah.
But I think this conversation is broadening that out to just embedded in our society, especially with men. And as we'll see, some of the trend lines of just the retreat from work among men all across the country are pretty concerning. So it really is that pro-work kind of discussion that aligns really well.
Yeah, and I mean, there's pros to being an economist, and the downside is sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in the dollars and cents of things. And I think this could have been a conversation that was really just about the money, the why are they not working, what are they doing with their time. But I think instead it does draw on this bigger picture of the purpose of men and how work contributes to everyone's purpose, but in this case, we're particularly talking to men about men. And I think so we really bridge both of those conversations here with Nick.
Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. Again, we are sitting down with Nick Eberstadt, author of the book Men Without Work. Let's jump into the conversation. Joining us now in the virtual studio is Nick Eberstadt. He's the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy for the American Enterprise Institute, and his domestic policy focus is poverty and well-being. And, of course, he's the author of the book Men Without Work, which is what we want to talk about today. Nick, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Hey, thank you for inviting me.
We brought Beth along with us, of course, because I am not an economist, and so anytime I can bring someone of Beth's caliber and expertise to dive into some of these economic issues, it's a huge benefit. And so, Nick, we really wanted to sit down and talk to you about your book, Men Without Work. Even though it's been out and kind of around for a number of years, in many ways it seems more timely than ever right now with a lot of the additional attention that's emerging around issues of men and boys and kind of how they're doing in society. So I'll kind of start us off then. Beth and I will both kind of chime in with thoughts or questions as we go. But kind of the big question I want to start with is your book does kind of paint what feels like a little bit of an alarming picture that millions of working age men are no longer working. They're not in the labor force anymore. They've left or they've stayed out or maybe they've never engaged to begin with. Can you just kind of give us the overall summary of what is going on with respect to men and work in this country?
Thanks, Nate. Well, I do think it's a very serious problem. In fact, the The first edition, the 2016 edition, had a subtitle, America's Invisible Crisis, because it seemed to me to be a very big problem that was being very overlooked. For 2 generations, there has been a flight from work by men in the prime of life. Our official statistics describe the 25 to 54-year group as prime working age for fairly self-evident reasons. It's not just dollars and cents. That's the part of a life cycle where men are probably most likely to be forming families and raising children. What we've seen is I think, really disquieting drop in work rates and a retreat, not just from the labor force, but from society more broadly, by a growing proportion of this group, which should be kind of our natural providers. Just to give you a sense of how significant this is, the monthly job report for April 2025, which is the most recent one we've gotten, it came out last week, suggests that the work rate for these prime-age men is essentially the same as it was the very first time it was measured with our modern employment statistical framework, which was in the 1940 census. To give you a little perspective on that, the national unemployment rate in 1940, in March 40, was over 14%. So we have basically a tail-end Great Depression scale work problem with American men today. Why don't we notice this? Because this was an employment framework that was developed for the Great Depression. People didn't measure unemployment well or accurately or continuously during the Depression itself, during most of it. They came up with this framework for the 1940 census. And the economists and statisticians who put this framework together, I don't think would ever have imagined that a man who was out of work wouldn't be looking for a job, which is the definition of unemployment. Last month, for every prime-age guy who was out of work and looking for a job, who was unemployed, there were over 3 guys who were neither working nor looking for work. So if you're only looking at the unemployment rate now to measure the male workforce situation, you're missing 3/4 of the problem. And that's unfortunately the situation that I kind of stumbled into in the first edition of this study. And I wish I could say that a lot has changed since then, but I don't think all that much has, either in terms of the trends or in terms of policy attention.
Can we shift gears a little bit to the why? Because I think, that this is happening is really well established here, thanks in large part to your work. Often when we talk about gender issues like this, they can be framed as sort of a zero sum. And I think that discourages some people from having these hard conversations. And so one of the things that comes to mind when trying to understand this shift is that women's roles, particularly in the labor force, but also in the family, have changed tremendously over this period. So what role is that playing in what's happening here? I mean, for good or for bad?
Well, Beth, that's a critical question. I'm glad you put your finger on that. Women have always worked. It's just a post-war phenomenon where they're being paid for work, right? And there's a tremendous entry into the paid labor force after World War II for American women. If they were just displacing guys from work, you'd have seen a flat line for overall labor force participation rates for the entire adult population, or for the 25 to 54s. But that isn't what happened. The labor force participation rate for adults went up over time. So there was a supplementary effect, not just a sort of a zero-sum effect there. And then after the year 2000, for about 2 decades, the overall labor force participation rate for prime age adults was declining, because it was declining for both men and women. Women were feeling some of the same pain as men. That's turned around recently, as you know. So now we see the highest ever labor force participation rates for prime age women. There's a footnote to that maybe we'll get into if you're interested in this. There's a little problem there that we aren't paying too much attention to. It's the female doppelgangers for the male dropouts. But really what I think we're seeing is a long-term, eerily constant increase in the dropout rate for prime age men. I mean, the labor economics literature tends to look at this problem, not unreasonably, in terms of structural transformation and economic change. The decline in demand for low-skilled work, outsourcing of work to abroad, technological disruptions, all of the rest of that. And that's perfectly fine as far as it goes. But I don't think it gets at the whole story, and actually I don't think it even gets at most of the story for these men. And I'll just give you two little examples of why I say that. The first is going back to this almost straight line up of not in labor force proportion, male dropouts from the labor force. If this were a function of the business cycle, you'd see it fluctuating the way the business cycle does. It doesn't fluctuate. It goes straight up, whether it's a recession or whether it's a boom time. The second thing that we see is that when we disaggregate the prime age men who are high school dropouts, we find out that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity there. If you look at foreign-born men in this group, their labor force participation rates are just about the same as for native-born guys who are college-trained. If you look at the rates for native-born men who are not married, they're down at like 50%. There's a huge discrepancy there. So there are many different components here that I don't think are adequately covered by a lot of the work that's been done to date in this area.
Yeah, it makes me think this idea of the, female labor substituting in for male labor, or there being this kind of economic explanation, that doesn't really, feel right. And it makes me think, there's likely what I would call like a sociological explanation here, something emotionally that's shifting or socially that's shifting for these men. And I know you don't write about this, but I wonder if you have thoughts on, what role that's playing here.
Well, when the first I came out with a second edition of this book in 2022. When the first edition came out, it was pretty well received, but I did have a number of critics, and I'm paraphrasing what they said, but more or less they said, Eberstadt, you moron, you don't understand that there's no work out there to be had. Which I don't think was true at the time. But by 2022, it was manifestly not true. You'll recall just a few years ago, we had this extraordinary peacetime labor shortage in our country, where we had, at least according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to the so-called JOLT survey, we had as many as 12 million open unfilled positions. And they weren't all for like hedge fund managers. There were a lot of jobs where basically the requirement was to be able to show up at work every day, on time, not stoned. And still, the needle didn't budge. The needle basically didn't budge. The number of male dropouts did not appreciably reduce. The NILF, the not in labor force proportion, did not appreciably change at all. These are clearly men whose mentality is different from the mentality of unemployed men. They did not see themselves as being part of the workforce. They do not behave the same way as men who are part of the workforce. And one of the little apertures that we have on how they live comes from the Department of Labor's time use surveys. Put together these annual surveys asking adults of different ages, men and women alike, how they spend their time from the moment they wake up until the moment they go to sleep, and also how long do they sleep. Within the roughly 7 million prime-age guys who are not in the labor force, more than 1 in 10 in this cohort. About a tenth, maybe a little bit more than a tenth, are actually full-time students. They're out of the workforce so they can skill up to get better jobs. The overwhelming majority are what the Brits would call NEET, N-E-E-T, not in neither employed nor in education or training. That's the part of the group that I think we really have to be concerned about, and that's 6 million plus, okay? If you look at that group, how do they self-report? Not what other people say about them. How do they self-report? They self-report that they're basically, my words now, not engaging much in civil society. Very little worship, very little charitable activity, very little volunteering. They've got a lot of time on their hands, but they don't say that they're helping out around the house much or that they're helping with other people at home. What they say they are doing is watching screens. They say they are spending 2,000, 2,100 hours a year watching screens. That would be kind of as if that were a full-time job. And they also, this is before the pandemic, about half of these NEET men say that they're taking pain medication every day. Not necessarily opioids, but some sort of pain medication every day. This, it sounds to me kind of like, and this is my words now, not the surveys, but it sounds to me disconnected from work, obviously, disconnected far too much from family, from community, from faith. There's a lot of pain and despair in this population. And one of the reasons we have been able to overlook it or ignore it as much as we have is because these men aren't out rioting or setting cars on fire. They're not posing a classic menace to society sort of problem. This looks much more like quiet desperation, or maybe even Ann Case and Angus Deaton's, sort of candidates for deaths of despair.
Nick, can I ask, do you have a sense of, because the problem you're describing, these men, is it that they were once engaged in the labor force, in civil society, but they dropped out for some reason and never re-engaged? Or did they never engage to begin with? I'm trying to get a sense of, I guess, when did this start in sort of the trend lines of the individuals? Did they get pushed out and feel like, well, why would I come back to the workforce, to civil society? Or was it never really there to begin with for them?
A very good question. Well, as we know from some of the longitudinal work that's been done on the labor market, there is a certain proportion of long-term unemployed problem tends to be more acute during big recessions and after that than during good times. But if you will, the mobility between unemployment and employment is much more fluid than between not in labor force and employment. Guys who drop out of the labor force tend to be long-termers. And the longer prime age man is out of the workforce, the lower his odds of re-entering the workforce. So a not entirely uncharacteristic trajectory would be leaving the workforce in one's late 30s, let's say, and maybe making an attempt to go back in, or maybe not making an attempt to go back in, but living in this alternative world, this NILF world, until one takes an early Social Security benefit pension in one's early 60s. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of lost human potential in this trajectory.
Would you say it's more? I think Beth alluded to sociological factors. Is it psychological? Is it cultural? Is it social? That kind of phenomenon, more so than sort of a structural economic phenomenon. And some of the context for that, there's actually a big debate right now, of course, around tariffs and industrial policy. There are some making the argument on the national stage that globalization has sort of hollowed out traditionally middle-class jobs, often filled by men, such as the manufacturing sector. And I've heard those arguments, and even in your book, when you welcome some of the critics, which is a great approach, by the way, welcoming the critics and then engaging good faith, it's incredibly refreshing. But some of them even point that out, that the decline in manufacturing, as they argue, and maybe the rise in service-oriented jobs, sort of structurally, there's sort of a bias against industries typically filled by men in favor of industries typically filled by women. I don't know if that's accurate. Those are some of the arguments, but how do you square those structural economic arguments with this idea that maybe it is a social cultural phenomenon?
Very good question. Well, I mean, we have to recognize to begin with that we're not the only developed society in the world, and we're not the only affluent country undergoing structural transformation and economic change. If you look at all of the never communist OECD countries, putting Poland and the Baltics and others in a somewhat special box. But if you look at Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, United States has just about the lowest level of labor force participation of any of that group, never communist rich countries. It's fallen faster and further than for any other affluent, never communist, Western democracy. Only possible exception is Italy. And I don't believe the Italian unemployment statistics or employment statistics. I mean, there's a lot of unofficial work that takes place in Italy, and so I'd make that a kind of a footnote or an asterisk. So, why is it that in France, Canada, Sweden, go through the list, countries whose proportion of employment accounted for by manufacturing, why in countries that have very similar declines in overall manufacturing share to the U.S., why don't you have the same, why are their levels of male labor force participation appreciably higher than in the U.S.? There's something else that's going on here that isn't going on in those other countries. I mean, I've got some guesses about that. One of them, obviously, and I say obviously, even though you see why other people might question that. Obviously, one of the reasons is our unique crime and punishment situation. We don't collect data in any sort of systematic or, to my way of seeing, in any sort of sensible manner on the population of felons and ex-felons, ex-cons in the United States. It's a mystery to me why we don't do this, but we don't. Maybe when there were only 1 million or 2 million ex-cons in the United States, you could say, well, this is acceptable, kind of oversight. At lunchtime today in the United States, there are probably something like 25 million adults with a felony conviction in their background. A very approximate numbers, maybe 1 in 7 adult men had a felony conviction during the course of their life. There's nothing close to that in other non-communist, affluent Western societies. And not having information on that, on that huge potential barrier to entry into the labor force, I think is a great big deal. We also haven't bothered to try to kind of map out the sort of social Bermuda Triangle that so many of our dropout men find themselves in. What is the crosshatch? What's the overlap between having a felony conviction, being on one or more sort of disability programs, being addicted to some substance or another? And if we wanted to, we could have a much, much better understanding of this sort of, Beth, as you put it, sociological problem. But since it does not seem to be entirely a conventional economic problem in the way that we're kind of taught to think about them, I don't think it's necessarily reasonable to think that market forces are going to draw people out back into the labor force just with more opportunity.
Nick, does that mean that when you're talking about sort of there is a lack of evidence with the population that either is currently incarcerated or previously incarcerated with respect to their engagement with work? As you were talking, one of the questions I had was to sort of test the hypothesis that the incarceration rates of criminal justice system plays a role. Do we not have the labor force participation rate specifically for folks who have never offended versus those who have offended, or work rates? Like, is there a way to separate out? Because my question would be, if the decline is still there, generally speaking, for men who have never committed a felony, never been incarcerated, then wouldn't that kind of say that, well, there's still something else going on?
Very good question. We can find some evidence on non-offender versus offender, or non-convict versus convict populations out of the National Longitudinal Survey on Youth. There is also another data set which looks at conviction and sentencing and employment data for about a dozen states in the United States. It's clear from both of these that regardless of ethnicity and regardless of educational attainment, a guy who's got an arrest in his record is dramatically more likely to be not in labor force than a guy who doesn't. And a guy who's served time. Not everybody who's convicted of a felony serves time. There's also community supervision. But a person who's been incarcerated is dramatically more likely to be not in the labor force than somebody who has, quote, only been arrested. Now, these data are not compiled and framed in a way that's entirely compatible with our Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly jobs report sorts of surveys. But my impression from working with them is that it's also true that even for those who have not been arrested and not been convicted, not been imprisoned, there's also a decline in workforce participation. So the explosion of crime and punishment, I think, is a big unobserved variable, but it's not the whole story either.
Nick, I want to ask you, kind of shifting a little bit to some solutions conversation, and maybe sort of a two-parter, I guess, to sort of set up the need for solutions. Number one, why is this a problem in your view? And as you articulated, I like how you use the term invisible crisis. That's actually in our conversations with Richard Reeves. We've had him on the show, and a lot of his work around his book of Boys and Men, that a lot of these variables have not had the level of attention that maybe they deserve. But as you said, it's because these guys are not rioting, they're not out there. So it's kind of like if they have exited the workforce, why is that a problem if largely they're watching TV, you know what I mean? Like, help us understand why this is a serious problem society should solve. And then I would love to spend some time talking about ways we should be thinking about solutions.
So there's why is it something we should be concerned with? And if it's something we should be concerned with, how come we've missed it for like a generation? We should be concerned with it because there's pretty much nothing good that comes out of it. What the very high proportions of male dropouts in the prime of life means for our country is slower economic growth, bigger income and wealth gaps in our country, higher dependence on welfare and disability programs, and under current public finance approaches, more public debt, more pressure on fragile families, probably less social mobility. I think, but I cannot prove, also less confidence in our civil institutions, the United States. And it's the epicenter of this epidemic of deaths of despair that we're seeing in the United States. And we're now in our third decade in this epidemic, is dropout guys. And so if it's not as if the men who are neither employed nor in education and training are brushing up on their Schopenhauer, learning Mandarin, or volunteering for work with Mother Teresa. It's a misnomer to say that they have leisure. They have a lot of free time, but leisure implies doing something elevating and self-improvement with free time. You can also use free time in ways that creates degradation. So one of the reasons we have missed this problem is the sort of category error I described at the beginning, where we have unemployed and employed, and you can find out the residual if you look for it, but it's not a readily available figure. It's not a headline figure each month. Another, as you mentioned, is that these dropout men are not rampaging and causing crime problems or social public security problems to others. There's also a sort of a ideological problem here, where in a world of social policy, where we are prone to categorize different groups as kind of victim groups or vulnerable groups, it doesn't compute to talk about prime-age men as a vulnerable, victim-dependent group. It's unnatural. I mean, it's been unnatural for most of recorded history. Men are supposed to be the providers. Men are supposed to be the protectors. It doesn't compute that they'd be dependents upon others who might actually be smaller and weaker than them.
Nick, let me poke on that for a minute, because something that I've noticed in the commentary on this issue, to the extent that it is growing, is that it does seem light on solutions, particularly, federal or state level interventions. And part of me wonders is if we were identifying these trends in other demographic groups, it seems like we might be quicker to be creating programs, doing some sort of spending to alleviate the problem. But I don't see that here. And I wonder if it's what you just described, this, hesitancy to put resources towards it.
I mean, that's certainly the beginning of it, Beth, is that there's not a predisposition to say this is an area where public policy or social policy should be involved, can be involved, can have promising potential. But when we talk about what can be done, there are things that can be done that probably can't be done by government or by public policy. I mean, public policy research looks at what you can do by pushing the buttons on the control panel, right? I mean, if I had the magic wand, and I could only do one thing, I'd fix the family in the sense of getting back to a 1965, say, U.S. family structure. When we compare our family structure today to the family structure back then, it's probably the biggest single difference is that if we had the same proportion of married men to prime-age men, the same proportion of married men with children at home that we had in 1965, we would expect to see a very, very different profile today. But that's not anything that any of us are going to be able to do. Within the realm of policy options, I'd look to three things, although there are doubtless others that others would profitably suggest. One would be improving options for skills. Our K through 12 education system, I don't need to belabor, is woefully uneven. And if college is not for everybody should complete their education with a skill that can support themselves, maybe support a family, a home. One of the big gaps there is what I would have my tongue torn out in certain educational circles for calling vocational, but everybody knows what I mean by vocational. The fact that vocational has become a sort of a freighted term, I think, is telling in and of itself. But the sorts of career and technical skills which can afford an individual a great earnings career without a 4-year degree is one thing that we could probably be experimenting with much more than we are. Other two things, a reform worthy of the name of our disability programs. Just as you can't get government estimates of how many convicted felons there are in our adult population today. You can't find an office in Washington, a bureau in Washington, that'll tell you how many Americans are receiving one or more disability benefits from our crazy quilt of different programs that don't talk to each other. And the programs were established for a very good reason, to help provide social insurance for people who couldn't work. But over the generations, they have kind of mutated, I think, very far from their original intention, and now in too many cases provide an alternative to returning to the workplace at a rather penurious level of income. I mean, it's enough to finance a non-work lifestyle, but not that much more. If we had a work-first principle in our programs, easier said than done. But if we had a work-first principle, it might be more expensive than what we're doing now, but I think we'd be trading a bigger problem for a smaller problem. And then there's the whole question, of course, of what to do about ex-cons. How can one experiment with different approaches to reentry, to repair one's employment reputation, reentry to society, reentry to families? That's a very, very big question, and an awful lot more needs to be done on that.
Nick, the last question I have, we have just a couple of minutes left. Beth, I want to make sure there's nothing else lingering in your mind to ask Nick, but on my mind, as you're outlining those potential solutions, I like all of it. I agree. Let's do all of those things. However, from this conversation, we've kind of been outlining that if the nature and scope of this problem is more of a social and cultural phenomenon rather than economic and policy, but the only solutions we can identify so far, economic or policy solutions, it still seems like there's a majority of the problem that we're missing. So is there a way to sort of broaden the lens to say that, yes, there could be a role for policy, but just thinking as a society, what do we need to do, very broadly speaking, to address this?
I'm glad you asked that. I'm really glad you asked that, because honestly speaking, I think that's why I was talking about the buttons on the control panel. That's only a small aperture on a big problem. I mean, it's impossible to talk in any successful way, or any potentially successful way about this problem if we simply regard the dropout men as kind of like isolated victims who are subject to sort of immutable social probability functions. What's missing from that sort of discussion, the kind of brutally materialist discussion, is human agency, is moral agency. And one of the reasons that there's this enormous difference in outcome odds for guys who have this little wedding band ring on their fingers and those who are never married isn't because this is made of gold and this gold is magic. It's because this all comes with a whole set of motivations and outlooks and values and aspirations and habits. So we have to regard this as we have to regard this as a problem of our communities. We have to regard this as a problem of our friends and family members and fellow citizens. And it's not. I don't think most of this is going to be solved in Washington. I don't think most of this can be solved in Washington. You can go around the country, and from one zip code to another, you can find radically different proportions of male dropouts, even within the same state, even within the same ethnicity. Probably what we need is much more community responsibility. We need people to recognize this as a problem, as their problem, not as somebody else's problem. And to the extent that we can inform citizens better through our churches and through our religious communities, that would be crucial. For people who are informed, concerned readers, One of the big gaps right now is you don't find much written by reporters or journalists about what it's actually like to live the sorts of lives that we're talking about statistically. If we had 100 reporters just kind of parachuted into different communities around the country, rural and urban in different states, just talking to people and observing, seeing how people lived, we might be able to get a little better over the empathy gap that I think characterizes our country at the moment. I'm not sure that my statistics are good enough to get over that empathy gap. I can kind of wave and say hi, but it doesn't put the human face on it that you all were asking for.
I think that's such an interesting comment, and I can almost hear an optimism in your voice as you talk about these sorts of cultural solutions that I also feel, because I think these, the kind of straightforward mechanism type policy interventions, those are the things I'm normally drawn to, but it just doesn't feel like it is, the big part of the solution here. And I think that's, your data, the story, the narrative that you're sharing, I think really reflects that. And, I think that's a harder conversation in a way to have, but I think it's becoming clear that that's where the conversation needs to be on this issue. So thanks for clarifying all of that.
Beth, if I could, that magic wand,
yeah.
if I had two things of the magic wand, the first one I said I'd fix the family. The second one I'd ask for another great awakening, and I'd settle for a small awakening, but or even a medium-sized one.
I don't know how to make either of those things happen, Nick, but I think that's fair to ask for that.
Well, it does go back to the importance of the civic institutions that here at Sutherland we talk often about even the family being an institution of civil society, in many ways the most fundamental, but our families, our churches, our community groups, and then kind of in concentric circles outwards, various associations that are civil, institutional in nature. And ideally, in a proper functioning society, there should be many layers before you get to even your state legislature and your governor, much less your members of Congress and president. And maybe a big takeaway from this conversation for me is we need all of these things to be working towards this problem, but it's very easy for us to focus on the policy solutions in Washington or in state houses. Yes, important, let's do those, but we also need to bring the civic institutions to the table in a way to sort of address the sociological components. It's going to take all of us together.
I think us
subsidiarity.
DC types tend to be very good about talking about those policy, big mechanistic interventions, and I think the others are a little bit harder to talk about, but I think it's important. I think this conversation has really called attention for me to that fact. That's where the conversation needs to happen here, even if it's uncomfortable.
Right. Well, Nick, we will leave it there. We're at time, but this has been phenomenal. We'll, of course, include the link to your book in the show notes. Encourage everyone to go read Men Without Work, who's interested in this issue. And, Nick, we'd love to keep the connection going as we work together to solve these problems, and just so grateful for your time and expertise on defending ideas.
Well, Nick, you know what they say in Washington, twice makes anything a tradition. We'll look forward to it.
We will do that. Once again, that was Nick Eberstadt with AEI, author of the book Men Without Work. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. Whenever we talk about important issues like the male flight from work in this country, it's normal to look to government to enact public policy solutions. And to be sure, there can be a number of different ways that public policy can make a difference on this issue. But here's a really important principle. It would be wrong to think that big, complex, society-spanning problems require only or even primarily public policy solutions. It's impossible to overstate the importance of institutions of civil society, the family, churches, local neighborhood and community associations. private employers and nonprofits. They each play an essential role. At the end of our conversation with Beth and Nick today, we identified that the factors causing this problem of men not working are largely cultural, social, perhaps even almost spiritual in a way. So to fix this problem, it will similarly require a broad and robust set of solutions that spans each of these sectors. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.